So we're here to speak about the Genius of Judaism, which is the last book written by Bernard-Henri Lévy. I'm going to say, as we're saying in French, BHL, Bernard-Henri Lévy. You never say in Paris, oh, I met Bernard-Henri Lévy. You're saying in Paris, did you speak with BHL? So I'm going to call him tonight BHL. So why did you decide to do this book about anti-Semitism in France and in Europe at this moment? And why did you decide to have this quite provocative title, The Genius of Judaism?
First of all, I must warn you that my accent is much worse. Be aware of that. You had a very pretty good example of what a French accent can be. With me, it will be worse. So, number one, it's not really a book, as you know, about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is only the starting of the book, because I do believe that Jews and Democrats have much better things to do than dealing with anti-Semitism, which is, at the end of the day, the problem of the anti-Semites more than mine.
You're right. It's just the first chapter of the book, and then you speak about different issues.
Number two, the chapter is important in the book, and I wanted to start the book with that because it was important for me to stress the fact that there is a new form of anti-Semitism today. A new pattern, a new system of legitimation, a new way of convincing large bunches of folks and of people to embrace anti-Semitism. And this new pattern, I try to demonstrate, it's not a plea, it's, I hope, a real demonstration, algebraical demonstration. The new pattern is based on 3 points. Number one, denial of Holocaust. Number two, anti-Zionism. Number three, rivalry of victims. This is the new pattern. This is a new enemy. If you are not aware of that, you miss the point. And maybe the most important aspect of the thing, I believe at the same time that anti-Semitism is on the rise, is going up, of course, with very terrible events, with death, dead people, killing. Today in France, the anti-Semites kill Jews, which did not happen since a long time, on one side. On the other side, I think that the anti-Semites are at the edge of being defeated. I don't believe that they are winning. I don't believe that they are the peak or the crest of the wave of the French society. And I believe that if you compare anti-Semitism today to what it was in the 30s of the last century, or to what it was in the time of the Dreyfus affair, it was probably more offensive, more concerning in this time than today. And I wrote this book also to say that, to say to the Jews and to just the normal people that who are normal people who are just Democrats, who are just Democrats, who are just taking care of the Republican idea, who are just thinking that anti-Semitism is not a creed, but a crime. This is what I call normal people. I'm trying to tell them that they are at the edge, at the verge of winning the game.
So when I was a journalist, everybody was telling me, you know, when you do an interview with BHL, it's really difficult to cut him off. So, because he's really passionate about what he's saying. I just would like to add two things. I would like to explore with you in a few moments what's happening also in the United States, because I think in your book you describe also anti-Semitism in the United States. But before that, I would like to pause for, again, a few minutes to think about a story which is really the symbol for me of anti-Semitism in France. And I would like to ask you to raise your hands if you know who was Ilan Halimi. Ilan Halimi, H-A-L-I-M-I, Ilan Halimi. So the 99% of you do not know who is Ilan Halimi, and is at this moment, and I think Bernard-Henri Lévy, BHL, is going to describe better than me what happened to Ilan Halimi, but he's the face of anti-Semitism in France.
Ilan Halimi was a young French Jew, and one of the proof of what I just said, that anti-Semitism kills again in France. 12 years ago, I think, maybe
2004.
2004.
2006.
Yeah. He was kidnapped by a gang of French anti-Semites. They detained him for days and days. They tortured.
Yeah, I just want to tell you something about the barbary, because it's a story which, for the Jewish community in France, is extremely important. He was a young guy. He was 22 or 23 years old, and he loved to party. And he went to a nightclub to dance with some people, and he met a beautiful young girl, and he wanted to bring this young girl to his home. He brought the young girl to his home, and when they were in the apartment, the young girl called some guys, and it was a gang, and they kidnapped him and they tortured him.
They tortured him to death, really, by all sorts of means. When he was nearly dead, they took him out of his jail and dropped him on the highway. They burned his body and he died. And what is terrible with the story of Ilan Halimi is three things, beyond the fact I told you now. Number one, his jail was not in a remote place, was not in Pakistan, was not in Afghanistan. It was in the heart of France. It was in a suburb of Paris, very close to Paris itself in a way. So it was under the eyes of everyone. There was a lot of neighbors. There was a lot of relatives around his place of detention. They certainly knew. They probably heard his screams of pain when he was tortured, and they did not say anything. It was a sort, because 99% of you don't know who is Ilan Halimi, but you know who is Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter. Ilan Halimi was a sort of French Daniel Pearl, detained, not in the jail in Pakistan, but in a jail in Paris. This is one thing terrible. The second thing terrible is that French police, French justice, and French medias, it took time for them to admit that this crime was anti-Semite. It took time. They hesitated. They discussed. They said, I'm not sure. They said, we don't have real evidence that this burning to death a young Jew because he was just a Jew is an anti-Semite crime. This is the second thing which adds to the sorrow. And the third thing which adds to the sorrow happened just a few days ago, 2 or 3 days ago. He was buried in France. And after 1 year, I think, his mummy, his mother, decided to exhumate his body and to bury him again in Israel. Why do you do that? Asked a lot of people. She said, I prefer to bury my dearest son in Israel because I am afraid that the same sort of barbarian come back to his grave and spit on his grave. So she conveyed her dear son in Israel. But there is still a little memorial in Paris, in the suburb of Paris, a little stone memorializing Ilan Halimi. And 2 or 3 days ago, the little stone memorial, modest, humble, was devastated, was raped with writings, with all sorts of things. And again, it added the disgust to the sorrow and to the horror. And even so many years after his infamous death, Ilan Halimi is still tortured beyond death.
So I think it was a quite important story for you to know, because at this moment in France we have a new president, but this deep movement in France, in my opinion, against the Jewish community is happening. And as you know, you have a lot of Jews who are fleeing France, who are moving to Israel, who are coming to Canada, who are coming to the United States, especially in Florida, because they think it's dangerous for their children to wear a kippah, to go to the street, and to be a target. Is it you live in France? I was living in France in the past 6 months, but in a political bubble, and before I was living in New York and Washington. Is it dangerous to wear a kippah and to walk in the street of Paris or of any city at this moment in France?
I would not say in Paris and in France, but in some areas in the neighborhood of Paris and of main cities, yes. You have some mothers who ask their little boy to wear a cap over their kippah in order to hide the kippah, because they know that the boy will be harassed, will be insulted, and will be beaten. There is a few areas, a few neighborhoods where this happens, yes, unfortunately.
What's the situation in Europe? Because we saw in the past elections, the far right made a lot of progress in the last German elections, Austria also. You said in your book that some supermarkets in Europe make sure that products made in Israel are not sold. You say that also in your book that at a Spanish music festival, a singer was censored because he was Jewish. You said that the wife of Johnny Depp, Vanessa Paradis, refused to sing in Israel. And you're saying also, and I didn't know that the FIFA, which is the European Soccer League, like the baseball team, banned the Tel Aviv soccer team to play. So what's your situation about anti-Semitism in Europe at this moment?
The situation is the anti-Semitism is high, but the antidote, the forces of resistance, are high also. This is a twofold aspect of the situation. It is high because there is more and more people who really believe that Jews are those terrible persons who are able to support a fascist state, which is supposed to be Israel, who traffic or invent their own martyrdom, which is denial of Holocaust, and who, by the obsessive remembrance of their own deads, overshadow other sort of martyrdoms which happen today. So there is an increasing number of people who believe these three things, that a Jew is someone who does these three things. Therefore, there is an increasing number of anti-Semites in France, and recruiting, as always, by the way, on the right and on the left, on both sides and from all sides of the political spectrum. On the other side, and this is completely new, for the first time in the history of France, of Germany also, the elite, the head of the state, the administration, is definitely, totally opposed to this new form of speech of hatred. We have a president in France, President Macron, who dared to say a few weeks ago, in blunt words, without turning around the subject, who dared to say anti-Zionism is, quote, the new shape, the new form of anti-Semitism. You have in Germany a chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, who does, since 10 years, no compromise of any sort when the question of Israel is on the table. You have an administration in general in all our countries of Western Europe who is very vigilant about that. I always quote this little fact, which is in my book. In France, in 1936, the year of the Front Populaire, which is a great moment of French history, Front Populaire, which is a popular moment with a great leader called Léon Blum who came into power and so on. When the parliament arrived, the new parliament of the Front Populaire, there was an election to know who will be the main speaker, who will be the president of the parliament of France. And there was two candidates. One candidate was who finally won, was a very decent man called Édouard Herriot, a great politician, very wise and old school. His competitor, his challenger, who nearly won, who arrived number 2, who gathered around his name a lot of voters among MPs, was a devoted anti-Semite. His name was Darquier de Pellepoix. A few years later, he will be the man of the Germans, of the Nazis, to deal with spoliation and mass killings of Jews for Germany. So in 1936, you could have in the French parliament 2 competitors to be the president of the assembly, one of them being a crude, savage, rabid anti-Semite, Darquier de Pellepoix. This today is absolutely inconceivable. In the French parliament, in the French administration, you cannot have that. So on one side, you have mothers who have their heart beating when their son goes out with a kippah. On the other side, they know that anti-Semites are in a way still outlaws in the French landscape.
What's, in your opinion, the French responsibility of the deportation of thousands of French Jews during the Second World War?
What is the
responsibility?
There is a consensus today in France, which is not new, which has been reasserted by President Macron, but which has been already expressed by President Hollande, President Sarkozy, President Chirac, and most of public opinion believe that. Most of public opinion know now that if French Jews were so massively deported to Germany, if French police arrived at 6 o'clock in the morning to arrest Jews in Paris in what was called La Rafle du Veldiv, if, to quote an infamous French Nazi, they did not forget the children, it is because most of public opinion in this time in France, in 1940, 41, 42, 43, agreed with that. All France was part of this collective crime. There has been, where tens of thousands of Jews were deported, were killed and never came back. There was no demonstration. There was no protest of any sort. The only protests were individual by great, decent, and brave single people who took the risk of protecting a Jew or hiding him. But massively, France agreed with that. Therefore, France did have a collective responsibility in the crime. Therefore, it is not the Vichy regime. It is not a minority of whatever the extent of Nazis who committed the crime. France as a whole, as a political body, was part of the crime and has still the duty of having the sorrow and bearing the mourning of this crime. This is what I believe. This is what our last presidents believe, and this is what most of France of today, except Front National,
the
except
party of Marine Le Pen,
Jean-Marie Le Pen,
the National Front,
and Marine Le Pen family, National Front, they are the only one today, the only political bloc who don't agree with this theory. Except them, it is important. They were, Mrs. Le Pen was challenging the candidate Macron in the last election, of course. But except her and her followers, most of France today, thanks God, believes in what I just told you. And it is important to believe that, not to feel guilty, of course not. But it is important to admit that in order not to repeat the crime, in order to know what France is able of, in order to know what could happen again if we did not take care of and if we did not remember.
You're talking also in your book about what's happening in the United States, and I thought you were asking a very interesting question regarding anti-Semitism. Has the United States caused the bug? What do you think? Because we saw recently with the white supremacist movement in Charlottesville, with the political atmosphere, that something is happening in the United States that I never saw before. My dream was to come to the United States in 1992. My parents were Jewish. Their dream was to have their daughter emigrating to the United States. And now, with what happened again recently in Charlottesville, I have the feeling I'm in a very different country than in the 90s. What's your feeling about this anti-Semitism movement in the United States?
What happened, for example, in Charlottesville was a shock for every free woman and man in the West and in Europe, not only in the States. It was a shock. I know that in France, the image is America being a safe haven, a fatherland of heart for every prosecuted in general, and in particular Jew all over the world. This is the image of America, and this is what America has been at the end of the day in most of its history. So what happened in Charlottesville was a shock, a double shock, by the way. Shock number one, because got out of the caves all these white supremacists whom we believed to be like ghosts, but they were really here. And number two, your president, who said that he did not want to take sides between two parts who had equally committed violent acts. So this twofold aspect of the story was a shock for all of us. All of us, I mean all real friends and lovers of America. All those who believe in America, the shining star upon the hill, all those who believe in American exceptionalism have been shocked by that, of course.
Do you think the president, I just would like to ask you a question about that. Do you think President Trump is deteriorating the image of America in the world?
Yes, I think he did. Alas. Alas, because this sort of deterioration, I'm not sure they can be repaired overnight. I'm not sure they don't leave behind them a lot of bleeding wounds. It will not be settled so well. So yes, there is a degradation, and it isn't the only one.
But in the same time, he's very pro-Israel also.
Is he really pro? You know, to be pro-Israel, no. To be, Anna, there is a very famous polemic between Gershom Scholem and Hannah Arendt about being pro-Jewish or not pro-Jewish and pro-Israel or not pro-Israel. And Gershom Scholem said, it does not mean to be pro if you are not inhabited by the love of Israel, the Ahavat Israel. If your acts of love are not, do not rely, are not supported by a true and strong and faithful inner love for Israel, it is worth nothing. Worth nothing because it can change. Because if the terms of the deal change, the position will change also, and so on. So, a supporter of Israel, he was also a big supporter of the Kurdish people. Wow.
So the Kurdish people is really a battle that BHL is doing in the past years. And he did two amazing documentaries. One is called Peshmergas, and the other one is called The Battle of Mosul, in which you see how the Kurdish people are trying to fight Daesh.
Yeah, they did fight Daesh. They were the more valiant fighters against Daesh. They were the bravest anti-Islamist. They were our boots on the ground. The boots on the ground of America and of Europe were Kurds. And the Republican Party in America and the Democrats, America in general, like France, said on and on that Peshmerga, the Kurdish fighters, were our friends, our best ally, that they were the only Muslim community or country in the area faithful to our values, faithful to secularism, practicing equality of women and men. Mr. Trump, as Mrs. Clinton, as Mr. Hollande, as all of us, had only that in mouth. When the time came a few weeks ago to prove that this love was true, that we were really ready to take some political risk in order to endorse and support them, we did not do. And Mr. Trump, especially, he was the worst, said, again, like in Charlottesville, I don't take side. Between, on one side, Prime Minister of Iraq, President of Turkey, and the guide of Iran, the gang of three, plus Bashar al-Assad, the gang of four on one side, and the Kurds on the other side, President Trump said, I don't take side.
He has decided to take side at this moment about the Iranian deal, which, as you know, in Israel, he's seeing as a direct threat. What's your feeling about that?
I feel it adds to the bizarre, to the strangeness, and to the inconsistency of the Western policy. On one hand, the Trump administration says that Iran is a real danger, that it is an existential threat for Israel and for the peace in the area. On the other hand, by dropping flat the Kurds, by letting the Iraqi army and the Shia Iran-backed militias crushing them, we bring on a silver plate to Iran what they dream of since decades, which is a big continuous arc going from Lebanon to Bahrain through Syria, Iraq, and so on. So America and the West in general, and France, who did her best to correct that, but who was rather alone, we really played the game. We made a huge gift in this Kurdish story, which it is happening now at this moment, to Iran. But to come back to the question about anti-Semitism in America, because I want to reply to the point. As I told you, Charlottesville was a shock. But in a way, I was not completely surprised, because I never believed that, I believed that America was this safe haven, but I never believed that America was immunized, was not corrupted by the anti-Semitic virus. If you think,
in which way?
If you think as I do, as I demonstrated, that the new anti-Semitism is anti-zionism, denial of Holocaust, and competition of victims. These three pillars of new anti-Semitism are present in America. The denial of Holocaust, at the end of the day, the Mecca, the big institution spreading the word of the denial of Holocaust are, alas, in America. on the West Coast, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, you have huge institutions who really feed the beast in Iran, in Europe, in France, who produce some revisionist studies, as you say, and who have their beating heart in America.
Because also the First Amendment is allowing free speech. The First Amendment.
Because of the First Amendment in particular. The rivalry of victims, the idea that by insisting on their own martyrdom, the Jews prevent the world to take care of other martyrdoms. You have, alas, a lot of people in America who believe like that. If you look at some radical segments of the African-American community, like, for example, Nation of Islam.
Yeah, in your book you said that Nation of Islam in 1994 spoke about the Black Holocaust.
Exactly. And they say on, and even recently, that you have to choose, that there is not room enough in an American heart to suffer and to sympathize with the victims of slavery and the victims of Holocaust. And you have a lot of people in America, too, like in France, who said you have to choose either the Jews or the descendants of the slaves, which is, by the way, completely stupid. I believe exactly the opposite. I believe that the sorrows feed each other, and that it is when you have in your heart and brain the memory of Holocaust that you are ready to sympathize and to see the coming of other sorts of suffering, bloodbath, slaughters, and so on. And I demonstrate that in the Genius of Judaism. I demonstrate how in all the second part of the 20th century, each time that you had a real big bloodbath and slaughter, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, and so on, those who gave the alert, those who made the ringing, the wake-up call in the world, in the international community, were each time people who remembered, not Jews, but people who had in their memory the Holocaust. People who knew that it can happen. People who knew the characteristic smell of the total extermination. It has always been like this. But you have in America, the second pillar, competition of victims, you have also a lot of... And anti-Zionism, at least the idea that the democratic countries give too much importance to the state of Israel, that they are not tough enough against Israel, that it is wrong to have such a big part of the national diplomacy of America dictated, quotes, by Israel. You have a big tendency of that also in America. I remember 10 years ago a book of two American scholars, Meir Shamer and Waltz. One, I think, was of Chicago, maybe not. This book about the American Zionist lobby, as they said, this book was a concentrate, was a cocktail of crude and strong anti-Zionism, which was probably more sophisticated and more violent than what we can have in Europe. So this to say, if you add to that, by the way, one word, if you add to that BDS, boycott, disinvestment, sanction, and if you add to that these two jaws of the beast, which are on the one side the white supremacist Charlottesville, on the other side the BDS campuses with some sometimes good-willing students who buy the theory and embrace the idea that Israel is a guilty country who has to be punished as such and whose products have to be banned, you have, alas, in America, a real current, a real wave of anti-Semitism as we have in Europe.
Okay, I disagree a little bit with you, but I don't want to begin an argument here. I just think as a Jewish person that America is giving a lot of amazing opportunities to Jews who are coming to this country. And I think it's easier to succeed in America when you're a Jewish person than it's in France and Europe at this moment. That's my personal opinion on that.
Of course, I agree with that.
When I just would like to ask you one more question, and then we're going to open the floor to you to ask questions. But when I was following Donald Trump during the campaign, Donald Trump was always making a joke. Paris is not Paris anymore. And I knew, and I know his joke by heart. He was talking about the Muslim community coming to Paris and coming to Europe, especially after the Bataclan attacks. And Donald Trump was quite almost racist about that. What's the reality of the Muslim community in France at this moment? It's a very sensitive theme when you're in this country, when you're saying to Americans, I'm coming from France, one of the first questions is, what's happening with the Muslim community?
The problem is not the Muslim community in France or anywhere else. The problem is with the members of the French community who do not endorse the Republican and common value, who do not endorse our creed. You have, of course, in the Muslim community, some Islamists, some radical Muslims, whom we call Islamists, who do not endorse Republican values, who hate France, who hate Jews, and who have to be condemned and battled and combated and fought without mercy. But it is not Muslim as such. There is two dangers in this matter. Danger number one is to believe, as probably Mr. Trump would do if he was French. Thank God he's not. One danger is to say Islam is the problem. It is not true. The symmetrical danger is to say Islam is not a problem at all. It is a symmetrical point. Islamism has nothing to do with Islam. Radical jihadism is only homonym, has just the same name, but just by chance than Islam. Not true. There is a relationship. So to deny the relationship between Islam and Islamism on one side, and to make Islam a bloc of suspected citizens on the second side, these are the two dangers which any wise and responsible European, French, or American has to try to avoid if we want, number one, to be fair, and if we want, number two, to avoid what the Islamists want, which is the civil war.
Thank you so much. We're going to open the floor to some questions. So if I know that the first question is always difficult, but I'm asking you to ask tough questions. Yes. There's a microphone which is coming to you right now.
Thank you. My question is, well, first a statement. There is, even amongst American Jews, within the Jewish community, there is a lot of conflict and feelings about Israel. It's sort of all over the map. I'm not talking about people who are anti-Semitic, I'm talking about Jews themselves. And I just wondered if you could speak to the way in which I guess what I'm wondering, do you completely conflate, is anti-Zionism, or people who are critical of Israel, is that a synonym for anti-Semitism in your point of view, or is there a distinction to be made about different points of view about Israel that include, on the one hand, complete support of everything the government of Israel does, and on the other hand, people who actually hate Israel, as a country? So Are there other gradations? Because it seems like the way you present it, it's very black and white. Either you're anti-Semitic or you are supportive of protecting the Jewish people. Is there a gray area in between?
It is not black and white. Anyone, starting with you, starting with me, has the absolute right to criticize, to condemn the policy of the government of Israel. Government of today, government of yesterday. This is a democratic rule. We can do that, and we have to do that, and this is democracy. When the problem begins is when we see that Israel is the only country for which we deduce, we conclude from our criticism against the government to the illegitimacy of the country as such. I never heard anyone criticizing the policy of Afghanistan, of the Taliban, saying that Afghanistan should not exist. I did not even hear someone horrified by the murder of Daniel Pearl, horrified by the irresponsibility of the leaders of Pakistan, who is a new country also, new country, same age, saying that Pakistan should not exist. I never heard, I don't know about any movement of opinion in America or in Europe saying Pakistan should not exist. Pakistan is illegitimate. So this way of concluding from the criticism of a policy, jumping from the criticism to the refusal of the very existence of the country is very specific to Israel. And number three, what I say, if you listen to, in my broken and so bad English I try to say, is not only that anti-Zionism is the new form of anti-Semitism. I said to you that the only way for anti-Semitism to express itself today is anti-Zionism. If you are anti-Semite, if you want to be heard, if you want to recruit, if you want, God makes no, but to make a sort of mass movement, the only way to do it is through anti-Zionism. So the question is not, are anti-Zionists always anti-Semite? The question is, how can an anti-Semite deal without being an anti-Zionist?
By your own admission at the beginning of the talk, you said that anti-Semitism was merely the first chapter of your book. So I'd like you to hear you speak a little bit about the genius of Judaism.
But you still have the book to discover that. It's in paperback now. So I dare to recommend. Genius of Judaism is, we should have to spend hours and hours. But there is one word you know very well, which is humanism. Okay? Humanism. Taking care of the other. Feel responsible for the other person. Feel that you are not the center of the world. Feel that the center of the world is the cursed, damned woman or man of, what did I say, Darfur, Rwanda, Bosnia, and so on, or Kurdistan. This is at the very core of the message which is written in, which is embedded, which is graved in the memory of Judaism. And the genius of Judaism, which is available for anyone, Jew and not Jew, is probably that. This way of saying to the other, especially when he is cursed and martyrized, you first, after you. This is certainly the genius of Judaism. If I had, we have little minutes remaining and a lot of people want to ask questions. If I had one sentence for my reply, I would say that.
We are back here.
Yes.
Mr. Lévy, thank you for your wonderful writings. In India, we say that the fragrance of a flower blows with the wind, but the nice words of the writers always spread everywhere. And it's been remarkable listening to you in person. My question is that there's been a lot written and seen about retreat of Western liberalism, this liberalism that's given us the modern world, including dealing with anti-Semitism, and it's on retreat everywhere. And you think that is the cause of a lot of our problems. And how does Western liberalism now regain its rightful place and give us a new next modern world that is free of, and not just anti-Semitism, but all other forms of hatred, and a very prosperous world?
I would say it in another. I would say it in another way. I told you about this crazy argument of the anti-Semite who say, if you speak too much about Holocaust, you overshadow the other slaughters. My conviction is that the anti-Semite of today, the anti-Zionists of today, those who believe that Israel is the guilty number one of all that happened, all the bad which happened in the world, they overshadow all the other sufferings, all the other miseries, all the other unnamed, uncounted, graveless, dead and people in the world.
You're saying in your book, for instance, I just want to add something which was quite interesting for me. You're saying in your book that when something is happening in Israel, like the war in Gaza, then you see in France and in Europe more and more often demonstrations against Israel, and slowly but surely the anti-Palestinian movement became also an anti-Jewish movement. Could you explain that?
My point is not to demonstrate that people demonstrate in favor of Palestinians. That is, of course, I understand that. I am myself favorable since 50 years to a Palestinian state. My surprise, and what is scandalous for me, is that the same who demonstrate for the so-called rights of the Palestinians, I never see them. I never saw them in the same street to demonstrate again against the martyrs in Syria, the dead in Darfur, the dead in Pakistan or Afghanistan, and the dead in Rwanda. When the real point is that when Israel is not in the game, when Israel cannot be named and designated as the guilty one, they don't care. They don't care about... it is good to demonstrate when you have 2,500 people killed in the war in Gaza. But when you have not 2,000, but 400,000 dead in Syria. When it is not Israel the guilty one, but an Arab president, Bashar al-Assad. Why nobody in the streets? Because the only reason, I'm sorry, but tell me if I am wrong, is that they don't care about the victims. They care about Israel. They care about Bashar al-Assad. They want to... when it is Bashar al-Assad who kills 400,000, it's okay for them. When it is Israel who kills 2,000, then it's a huge scandal, and they demonstrate. This is what I wanted to tell you. The anti-Semitism, in the new form of anti-Zionism, overshadows, makes people of today deaf and blind to all the others slaughters of the planet of today. Remember Durban, this place of South Africa where 15 years ago, where all sorts of NGOs gathered in order to condemn racism, slavery, and oppression. People came from all over the world, from Bangladesh, from India, from South America, from Tibet, from all over the world. They condemned because they believed that their time had come, that they had at the end a stage to express their misery. During the 4 or 5 days of the event, the only subject was Israel. The only victims named were the Palestinians. There was only one state considered guilty of all the harm which happened in the world, which was Israel. Conclusion of that, all these people coming from Bangladesh, Darfur, Tibet, and so on, they came back home in tears. They could not express one word. They cannot plead their cause. They were literally banned and overshadowed by this tam-tam, by this vacarme, by this deafening noise made by the pro-Palestinian activists who at the end of the day did not give a shit, did not give a damn about the real misery of the real miserable of today. And this is the second crime of these anti-Zionists. First crime, they rehabilitate anti-Semitism, they give him its new garments, but second crime, they push into despair all the cursed and the damned of today.
Another question in the front. Yes, this lady in the front in the second row.
We have time for just one more question.
Okay.
But before we get to that, my colleague Jen has an announcement about the book signing.
Hi, if you would like your book signed after the program, the signing will be directly out the doors to your right here, and we'll extend the line to your right down the hallway. If you do not want your book signed, you can exit the house through those doors over there. Thank you.
We recently visited the Camp de Mille, which is a camp, like a Holocaust memorial museum in southern France. And I wonder if many French people know about it and visit it. And they also, like our Holocaust Museum, Illinois and the US, are trying to spread the word about all the genocides in the world. But are people in France aware of that?
Some know, some don't know. We don't know enough. We don't memorialize enough. I am a militant of memory for 2 reasons. Again, same way of reasoning. Number 1, because we owe that to the deads. Because there are some wounds and some deads who will bleed for long and long. The definition of crime against humanity, according to a great American author, Philip Sands, is that. And according also to French philosopher Emmanuel Lévy, crimes who bleed till the end, who will bleed until the end of the time. So never enough, never too much. And another reason why we have to know more about all museums of all memorials about Holocaust is because it protects, the memory protects the others. Not only the deads, but the livings, and not only the Jews, but all sorts of human beings who can be tomorrow or day after tomorrow treated as the Jews were. If we know, if we learn how it was possible, how the mechanism could launch itself for the Jews, if we had really known, if there had been many Holocaust museums, more in France and in America, maybe the Rwanda genocide would have been stopped very soon. Maybe we would not have let, with such a guilty indifference, the genocide in Darfur continue probably till today. Maybe we would not have let Saddam Hussein 15 years ago, and maybe his followers today committing genocide against the Kurds. if we know what is genocide, if we know, if you and if we know the engineering of the mass crime and of the crime against humanity, then we have a little tool, hopefully, to prevent the return of the crime and the comeback of the ghost.
I just would like to finish to thank you for coming. I hope it was interesting for you.